Hi, everyone. Dr. Justin Golston here, and welcome back to the Certified Supply Chain Demand Planning and Forecasting Professional course. This is session 8, where we're going to be discussing sales and operations planning. So within this session, we're going to discuss how S&OP, so we're going to refer to sales and operations planning as S&OP moving forward. So we're going to discuss how S&OP fits within the organization. So we're going to understand the definition of S&OP, and we're going to understand the utility of S&OP and why it's important for an organization. We're going to discuss the mechanisms of S&OP, all of the inputs to S&OP. We're also going to discuss the elements or the steps that go into an S&OP process from a monthly perspective. And then we're going to discuss how we can effectively implement S&OP. So throughout this course, we can talk a lot about the tools and approaches and the theories, but without the implementation, it's just all talk. So we're going to talk about how we can actually effectively implement the approaches that we discussed today. So just very quickly, just think to yourself, at the current state within your organization, where does your organization fit in terms of adopting S&OP? Within your organization, have you successfully implemented S&OP? Have you implemented, but it's not working well? There's a few gaps, and you're looking to find some tools to effectively implement a re-implementation, if you will, for S&OP. Or you're actually implementing, you're putting it into practice from a sales and operations planning perspective, or are you not yet implementing it? And hopefully this session can bring some insight into how you can effectively implement S&OP within your organization. So what effectively is S&OP? What is sales and operations planning? Well, we're going to delve into that throughout this session, but S&OP, some refer to it as executive S&OP. We'll be using that. We'll be referring to both of those terms throughout this session. But it is a midterm planning approach and falls in the middle of the organizational long-term business strategy and within the tactical, the day-to-day operational plans and strategies. So it kind of falls in between that. And you'll see throughout this session that it is, in order to effectively implement S&OP, we have to bring in all decision makers from departments, but we also need to bring in those individuals that perform the day-to-day, because they're the ones in the trenches, so they understand the day-to-day operations, which will impact the long-term strategy, long-term execution of the organization. So within the current state of supply chain management and forecasting, we can see that with the recent pandemic, pre-pandemic, pre-COVID, that C word, pre-COVID, supply chains and forecasts were already complex, right? And the pandemic increased the complexity, and for those that's in the supply chain within the forecasting discipline, we heard that buzzword, resilience. So we had to be resilient in order to fulfill our consumer needs. We had to be resilient in order to ensure that our employees were handling the current situation. So As we can see with this caption here provided by Tom Wallace, there's going to be a number of references to Tom Wallace. A number of these slides were extracted from the writings of Tom Wallace, who is the pioneer of sales and operations planning of S&OP. And as supply chains become larger, as we begin to work with international organizations, with business partners, as we continue to expand our operations overseas, forecasting and supply chain management becomes more complex. And what S&OP provides you is that coordination. It provides you, and I'm going to refer to this often, is that supply chain orchestration, so that all departments within the organization, all business partners from our organizations can collaborate to ensure that everyone is on the same page, so that we can fit those demand needs, and that so we can effectively supply our facilities with the materials that we need from a forecasting perspective. So the inputs to complexity is, the manufacturing. We've seen that this whole lean manufacturing concept was tested with the pandemic. There are some analysts, there are some people within the space that said that asked the question of, can we still operate from a lean perspective, from a lean manufacturing perspective? Can we still operate from an area where we can reduce inventories, right? Given the supply chain disruptions we have been experiencing over a year now, So the input, is going to be, one of the inputs is going to be lean manufacturing, where we have to bring in all of the decision makers, all of the departments of an organization to understand how lean can we actually be. Another input is global businesses. As we said before, the larger our supply chain network becomes, the more complex it becomes. And then, we have the lengthy supply chain. So given that we have a number of business partners that participate within our supply chain networks, they're experiencing disruptions similar to how we are, right? So that is extending those lead times, and because of that, we have to ensure that the inputs, that our ERP, our enterprise resource planning applications, are up to date from a data perspective, to ensure that those lead times are indeed accurate given the current situations, so that those inputs are effectively built in within our forecasts. So from a high level, from a 50,000 foot view, there are a number of inputs, a number of outputs to executive S&OP, to regular S&OP, to operational S&OP. So you can see that there's inputs and there's outputs. We have to assess a number of things from an organizational perspective, such as, what is the current volume from a demand and supply perspective. We want to look at the macros, if you will, from an organizational perspective. We have situations such as inflation. We have situations such as war. We have interest rates that can increase, and that could essentially impact our decision making, right? And because of those inputs, because of those enterprise environmental factors, we have to, take a look into risk management. We have to understand what risks we have from a supply chain perspective, which is going to impact our forecast. And we have to consider that when we're discussing S&OP among decision makers in the organization. So That's the high level. So that's the executive level, the strategic. You could review that as from a strategic perspective, but then you also have the middle ground where you look at demand planning and forecasting. That's where that comes in. And then you have supply and capacity planning in that one, we have supply chain disruptions from a material perspective, but in some parts of the world, we have in the last few years, we have heard the term the Great Resignation, where a number of organizations are faced with capacity constraints from an employee perspective. And given that we have capacity constraints from an employee perspective within our organization, we may have issues with producing product, but our business partners also have a similar issue. So if our raw material provider is having capacity issues or having employee issues similar to what we have, then that's going to extend our lead times for our raw materials. With that, not only do we have to increase our lead times for our raw materials, because we have capacity constraints, we have to increase the production lead times within our organizations because we're constrained from an employee perspective, right? Now, you also have operational sales and operations planning. So that's the day-to-day operations. And that's where the master scheduling comes in. That's where the plant scheduling comes in, and those are inputs into our forecast. And then you have supplier and distribution scheduling, so distribution requirements planning, right? And whenever we talk about distribution scheduling, one thing that's often overlooked is the scheduling of logistics, right? So similar to facilities that are having capacity constraints, trucking companies are having capacity constraints. Airlines are having capacity constraints. Ocean freight, they're having capacity constraints. So we also have to have that as an input as well. And those are the discussions that have to be had with the sales, during the sales and operations planning discussion among decision makers. Then from an operational perspective, you also have the input such as Kanban, if you're working in a lean environment, in advanced planning and scheduling, if you do use those, what we refer to as advanced forecasting techniques and approaches. So from an executive S&OP perspective, what is executive S&OP? So it is an executive decision-making process. So given that the executives are receiving all this information from all departments of an organization, although a number of organizations say that they collaborate, the reality is a number of these departments work in silos, right? So that executive is going to have to be the one that kind of creates this knowledge sharing type environment, right? So that all departments share this information with each other so that all of the departments can make effective decisions within the organization. So we also have to deal with the volume of our raw materials, deal with the volume of our finished goods, both from a unit perspective and from a dollar perspective. So that's where you're going to have the production, the director of production, or the head of production, and then the CFO, controller, or head of finance to come together to say, okay, we have an increase in demand. Do we have the budget to bring in more employees? Do we have the budget to pay overtime? Right? Do we have the budget to bring in additional inventory? On the flip side, if we have excess inventory because organizations did not communicate with sales, and we did not reach a consensus based on those sales forecasts, How do we reduce our inventory levels and our excess or obsolete inventory? So the executive will also link so they'll take that operational plan, that tactical plan, that short-term plan, and link it to that long-term strategy or that long-term financial plan. And once again, we all have to come to a consensus so that we're looking at one set of numbers. We also need to facilitate risk management. Risk management is one thing that we're going to talk about a lot within this session. So we want to mitigate our risk due to supply chain disruptions. Now we're not going to, but now there's going to be enterprise environmental factors that are out of our control. But if we are cognizant of the macros, if we are aware of all of the global disruptions that we may encounter, we're able to identify mitigation strategies to combat those risks. And we want to executive sales and operations planning is the foundation to create that strategy and policy for the organization. So executive sales and operations planning, once again, we talked about the master scheduling. So the master scheduling is going to be an input, is going to be vital to executive S&OP. Distribution requirements planning, once again, we said that if we are working if we operate multiple facilities throughout our supply chain network, distribution requirements planning is going to be essential to that, so that if we do have supply chain disruptions, if we do have extended lead times with our vendors overseas in China, for example, or in the Ukraine, for example, then we're able to transfer raw materials or finished goods or sub-assemblies from one distribution center to another. We also are going to look at plant scheduling. So that's where the employees come in. That's where the machinery comes in. So, and then once again, the supplier scheduling is going to be an important part to ensure that those lead times are indeed updated in our ERP application, so that we can have effective and as accurate as possible forecast. So when we look at executive S&OP, again, we have a number of inputs. So I'm going to be drilling into the fact of the importance that all departments need to bring in their knowledge, bring in the things that they are working on from an inventory perspective, from a forecasting perspective, from a planning perspective, into that executive S&OP meeting and implementation and approach. So, for example, sales and marketing is going to provide the input and forecast from a unit perspective by family. So we want to begin at a high level. So we're going to do it at the family, and then we're going to drill down. And then finance is going to provide us with the budget that we have from an inventory perspective, from an administrative perspective, from a warehouse perspective, in terms of the budget that we have to produce those goods and services. So if sales and marketing provides a forecast at the family level, then it's going to cost us this much to produce those products that sales and marketing is forecasting, and then finance is going to come in and say whether or not we have the budget to produce those goods based on the forecast. Then comes in the operations. So if we're working in a production facility, we are saying, okay, yes, we have, so sales and marketing provides us with a budget. Sales and marketing provides us with a forecast. Finance says, yes, we can meet that. But then operations can come in and say, we don't have the employees to produce that amount of products, right? So then now we have to come to an agreement, or now we have to go back to finance to say, okay, do we have a budget to bring in more employees, to bring in more temps to produce these products? If we bring in more employees, now what's the training budget? How long is it going to take to onboard those new employees? So that is the discussions that we're going to have with the sales and operations, with the executive S&OP meeting and sessions. And then if we are looking to roll out new versions of products, if we're looking to roll out new products, that's where product development comes in, and R&D and engineering will come in to say, okay, do we have the budget for the research and development for this? Do we have the budget to produce prototypes for this? And then they'll come back. The product development will then go to sales and marketing to say, okay, how do we roll this out, and how do we run testing to get the sentiment, to get the consumer thoughts on these new products? So those are the situations. Those are the type of conversations that we have during the S&OP meetings, sessions. So from a business level planning perspective, as we said, sales and operations planning is a medium term plan. So you can see the long range planning can go out to 5 years, just in this graphical representation. And then we also have the annual plan, where we're going to do the annual budgets each year. This is an iterative process. We do this each year. And then executive S&OP is kind of looking out to this 2-year time span to plan out these products and services. So we talk a lot about executive S&OP. So what is the role of the executives? What's the role of the leadership within the organization? So the executive has to bring all decision makers together. The executive has to bring in all department heads together and provide stewardship. So that, because there's going to be a disagreements, the sales team and sales and marketing team is going to throw out all of these forecasts, these high level forecasts that may essentially be unattainable from a production perspective. They may be unattainable from a financial perspective. So the executive has to provide stewardship to these discussions. They have to make the decision and break ties for these discussions. And one interesting approach that I've implemented, and one approach that we see a lot within professional services is, you have to set high standards. You have to set up those stretch goals so that we can work toward those goals. Right? We can work toward those goals. And if we fall short of those goals, we're still going to be in good shape from a stakeholder or shareholder perspective if you're a public company. But then I think that the most important role that the executive provides is to motivate and empower the workforce. Motivate and empower those decision makers, motivate and empower those department heads to reach those goals, to work together to reach those goals. Because from an organizational perspective, from an S&OP perspective, everyone's working toward a common goal. So for the executive, the monthly time commitment is roughly 1.5 hours. So it's not that much of a commitment from an executive perspective, but the executive has to be involved within the process. So this is just another high level. We just reviewed this slide. But whenever we say the executives, I'm referring to like the president, the CEO of the organization. And again, that's the inputs where sales and marketing, finance, operations, and product development is going to provide their forecast, provide their plans, provide their approaches to the president, and then everyone comes together to come to an agreement or consensus. So whenever we're looking at sales and operations planning, we want to look at the benefits. So that's one of the first questions that I receive from an S&OP perspective is that, okay, what's the benefits, right? How is this going to benefit me? Just another methodical process that you consultants, bring to play. But it's documented that sales and operations planning is going to increase customer service. Now, because we're breaking down those silos, because sales and marketing is working with finance, they're working with production to ensure that they can meet those sales forecasts, then customer service is going to increase. We look to no longer have those stockouts because everyone's on the same page. Now, that because everyone understands these sales and marketing forecasts, then we can essentially bring the inventory down, because now you have people with different expertise, people with different knowledge, different skill sets to come together and discuss those forecasts. So with that, that's going to bring inventory down. That's also going to bring obsolescence down. Now, because all of these departments are working with each other, those freight costs will also come down, because we are mitigating the risk of overnight shipments and air freight, and things like that. Order lead times, going back to our discussion on the importance of updating your lead times within your ERP application. If we are monitoring that from a data perspective, we're going to get into data later on in this presentation. If we are consistently updating our lead times based on our receipt history from our suppliers, then we are going to be able to get more accurate lead times, which is going to feed into our forecast, which essentially is going to provide more accurate forecasts, right? Now, supplier lead times. With supplier lead times, this kind of goes into the order lead times as well, in that this goes into supply, if we're updating our lead times from a supplier perspective, as well as from a consumer perspective, the bringing in all the decision makers for purchasing, production, sales, and marketing, because everyone's on the same accord, we are able to reduce those lead times. Also, times to launch new products. If R&D is in those meetings, then they can work with production, they can work with finance to ensure that they have all the materials that they need, they have the budgets they need in order to effectively develop those new products, those new prototypes, to get those out to the consumers, to get the consumer feedback, get a voice of the customer. And then plant productivity. If we are looking at our capacity planning, and we are integrating capacity planning into our forecasts, then we're actually going to bring up our plant productivity. So that's one thing that so I'm speaking to small and medium enterprises, but that's one thing that's amiss for some small and medium enterprises whenever they're setting up their ERP applications, in that they do not really consider or do not update their capacity requirements or constraints. So that's the hard benefits. So from a soft benefit perspective, if we're implementing sales and operations planning, if the executive is pushing this sales and operations planning approach, then we're going to have that enhanced teamwork. That is one thing. The people, we're going to talk about the importance of the people within this process. We're going to talk about the importance of people in all the processes and in other sessions. But enhanced teamwork is one thing that's going to increase our forecast accuracy, because everyone feels they have skin in the game, if you will. And with the executive S&OP approach, you are empowering, you are encouraging the workforce, you're encouraging those decision makers to work together toward that common goal, which I continue to refer to. But all of this is a top-down approach, you know. So the executive is going to be pushing this initiative, and then if they are influencing the decision makers, the department heads for this process, then that's going to also provide a trickle-down effect from the department heads to the employees of each department, so that those employees also have input. If the employees feel they have input, then they're going to be empowered to reduce costs from the organization, update those lead times, and increase efficiencies, which will lead to supply chain orchestration. So you also, with the soft benefits, you have improved communication. So once again, we are breaking down those silos within the organizations, because we are bringing all departments of the organization together. We also want to provide better decisions. So because if we are continuing to update the data within our ERP applications, in some cases updated data in Excel spreadsheets, we have increased visibility of the data, of the forecasts. And if we have increased visibility of the forecast, if we have increased collaboration and communication among the departments of the organization, then our data is going to be more accurate, which will lead to improved decisions from a forecasting perspective. So because we have all of the data, because we are communicating among the department heads, then we're able to also reduce costs, which will enhance the business planning from a cost perspective for the organization. And then given that we are having all of the department heads together and we're working together, we are providing greater accountability for each department, right? So if these sales and marketing heads are providing these forecasts, right, and we're all on the same page, we're all collaborating within this sales and operations planning efforts, then everyone's accountable. All departments are accountable. All the heads are accountable. And then also this provides greater control, because everyone is collaborating among each other and we can provide greater control. And then it also will give you a better window into the future. Now, some of you may be in environments where you feel that, you know, forecasts, you know, whenever we're generating forecasts, you're just throwing darts to the dartboard, right? In some of these meetings. Now, I say that because I've had executives tell me that, right? From my experience as a management and supply chain consultant. So with this collaboration among your business partners, you provide a greater window into the future in terms of the vision of the effort for the organization. So what is, at a high level, what goes into the S&OP process? So it's an iterative process, a monthly process, and it begins with the data gathering. So again, it goes back to the data has to be accurate. The data has to be input within the ERP application or Excel spreadsheet. And then, so once we gather that data, the next step is the demand planning, where we're going to actually pull that data. So the data that is gathered, that is the input into this demand planning step. And then the next step to that is going to be the supply planning step. So once we have gathered all of the actual sales, so the forecast versus actual in the previous periods, and once we have gathered that in the demand planning process, then we can look in the supply planning processes in step 3. And then from that supply planning process, so all these are inputs into the S&OP pre-meeting. So once we've gathered the data, once we have analyzed the data, once we have digested the data, once we have created preliminary spreadsheets to prepare for the meeting, then we go into the pre-meeting planning to discuss, some of the findings of the demand planning and supply planning efforts. And we're going to then identify the capacity constraints within our organization. So whether it be capacity constraints from a warehouse perspective, from a distribution center perspective, from a production perspective. And then once we have identified that and hit that up against the forecast, then we go into the executive meeting. And this is where there may be some disagreements among, so for example, among the sales and marketing team with the production team, or the sales and marketing team with the finance team. And then we have to find conflict resolutions, and which will then be discussed in the executive meeting. And then we go to look to implement what was discussed or what was agreed upon within the executive meeting. So once we go into the executive meeting, this is just one example of some of the topics of discussion from that sales and operations planning meeting. And again, we want to take a macro view. We want to take a macro view of our inventory. We want to take a macro view of the current needs of the organization. And we're going to consolidate all the product families within the organization or our inventory portfolio. Then we want to look at the customer service performance. We want to look at our order fee. We want to look at our KPI, our key performance indicators, right? So from a customer service performance perspective, we want to see how we performed based on previous periods. And once again, our forecasts are going to be very important to that. Our capacity, inputting our capacity within the ERP application or Excel spreadsheet is going to be vital to that particular topic. And then we're also going to talk about new product issues, new products, new versions of products, new updates. We want to look at, okay, for our new products, we had this forecast for these new products, which is a whole topic in itself within this certification program. And we want to see how our forecast met with our actuals from a forecasting perspective, and that's an input to our S&OP meeting. And then we're going to do a family by family, our product family by product family review during this meeting to see how these families are comparing to each other. And then we also want to look at, again, the costs from an organizational perspective to see if there's any rate changes from a production perspective. So I know that in some parts of the world, because of the Great Resignation, or because organizations have had a difficult time finding employees, also from a logistics perspective, any kind of rate changes. Because of the supply chain disruptions we have been experiencing for a while now. It's going longer than we anticipated and expected. So we want to talk about the rate changes and how that's going to impact our future plans. We want to, once we have all those inputs, so it's a step-by-step approach. So once we have understanding macros, once we have looked at our performance to our customers, once we have identified product issues, once we have done our family by family review, and then once we have assessed the rate changes and made those adjustments to our plan, then we want to say how much of an impact has that made to the overall business plan. So this is going to, especially in today's times, this has been one thing that a lot of organizations have taken a close look at, and that's one thing that we're going to continue to assess. And then we're going to provide a recap of all of the decisions that are made and ensure that all decision makers have reached a consensus in terms of the new plan. And then you want to do it. So when we say critique of meeting, we want to do a lessons learned. We want to do a lessons learned of this meeting. We want to do a lessons learned of the outcomes of this meeting so we can strive for continuous improvement, right? Anything that we do from a forecasting perspective, from an S&OP perspective, from a leadership perspective, from an organizational change perspective, we want to provide a retrospective. We want to provide a lessons learned to see how we can continue to improve the process. So I would say one of the top questions that are asked by leaders of organizations whenever we're introducing sales and operations planning is, who should be a part of this, right? And the department heads is essential to this, is very important to this. All the vice presidents of the organization should be a part of this process, so they understand, they can provide input, they can understand the thoughts of different departments of the organizations. We also want to bring in let me back up. So I did say that, we have essential bucket, probable buckets, and possible buckets, and we split these up into buckets because it depends on the size of the organization. So for example, for a large multinational company, this is applicable. The essential, probable, and possible is applicable. If we have a small and medium enterprise of 500 employees, for example, I would say that almost all these would be essential. Okay, these are my thoughts. This is based on my experience. Because so for example, we have probable, the demand planner and supply chain planner as probable, but for a small and medium organization, they're very essential because those are the people that have the most knowledge of the goings on, if you will, of the organization from a inventories perspective, from a finance perspective, from a sales and marketing perspective, right? So, and then also, if you have a small and medium enterprise, I would also include the master scheduler, the plant manager, as well as the purchasing manager, because they are the ones that, again, are working on the day-to-day operations, so they can provide vital and valuable input to that sales and operations planning effort. So for the executive S&OP meeting, it depends on the size of your organization. It depends on the culture of the organization. It depends on the environment of your organization. So only you as leaders can answer that question. This is just one example. Again, I think that this example is more for a large multinational organization, and for a small and medium organization, I would add more into that. But I would say that one caveat to that is that you don't want to have too many cooks in the kitchen whenever you're doing this. But I think that, for example, master scheduler, plant manager, purchasing manager would also be vital, would be vital to this initiative. So we talked about all the benefits to S&OP, but there are some risks. I think that we have seen that with the pandemic and the supply chain disruptions we experienced in the pandemic. So within the current states of the supply chain, we can see that supply chains are extended. I think that it's very difficult. It's very difficult to not interact with international business partners when we're talking about raw materials and supply chain management and things like that. Now, whenever we talk about supply chains being brittle, again, we've seen that with the pandemic, where not only are we experiencing disruptions, our business partners are experiencing disruptions as well. During the pandemic, we've seen where competitors, were working together to work toward a common goal. Perfect example of within the United States, FedEx and UPS might be the biggest competitors in all of supply chain. That can be argued, but I think that they're up there. They're up there on the list. And they came together to split the United States in half to distribute the vaccines, right? So because the supply chains were brittle during the pandemic, you had competitors working with each other to meet a common goal for society. We've seen longer lead times. We see longer lead times in all industries right now. So that's one thing that we've experienced, in S&OP is one thing that can assist in that. And then we have those variable lead times, because in some industries, based in some countries, whether it's in some countries, some organizations will actually pay to get to the front of the line. So you'll have these variable lead times. So although it may not be the case in the United States for in some of your industries, in other parts of the world, it's commonplace. It's commonplace. So you'll have these variable lead times where someone can jump in front of the line, because they paid an additional charge because they needed it more. They feel they needed that product or raw material more than you did. So how can sales and operations planning help with that? Once again, because these departments have different insights, have knowledge of different aspects of these environmental factors, we can work together. These departments can work together to anticipate these disruptions. So like the head of logistics can provide input to say, there's a shortage of truckers. Right? Maybe yes, we've used this one provider for a number of years, but they have a trucker shortage, right? So maybe we should go to someone else to ensure that our lead times remain as stated. So we have a number of things where we can create this knowledge sharing type environment, so that we can mitigate the risk that these disruptions have provided in the last couple of years. So from an S&OP perspective, how can we hedge? How can we hedge in these types of situations? So again, we have a discussion. We have a discussion of lean, of the future of lean. From a supply chain perspective, lean may still be applicable in some industries. Some maybe not. That's up to you to decide the future of that within your respective industry. So safety stock. Safety stock is one thing that is going to be a hedge. Now there's one discussion that I had on a panel within India, where it's going to be very difficult to hold pandemic inventory, pandemic black swan inventory, to mitigate the risk of another COVID-like disruption. I had discussions with an organization in the United States about monkeypox that arose a while ago, and it's hard to anticipate, just like the pandemic was hard to anticipate. So it's going to be up to you. It's going to be up to your decision makers of your organization to see whether or not these hedges are applicable to your organization. Now, safety stock is one thing that we can provide for a hedge, safety time, so we can add a buffer to our lead times based on the disruptions that we encountered. So we can go back to our history, to our receipt history of our raw materials to see, okay, what was the average lead times, and then we could potentially add a buffer to that, right? And then if the customer pushes back, then we can provide them with the data to say we were on time, this percentage of time, right? So also location may be a little more difficult, but we could actually, rent out space in certain parts of the country and certain parts of the world. We can also do consignment inventory. We can also do things such as postponement. Postponement's not on this list, but that is another thing, another consideration that could provide a hedge, as well as how we can strategically locate raw materials and sub-assemblies and finished products, around the world by renting out space in other distribution centers or warehouses. So once we have looked at that, then we can see all of those hedges that are applicable for your organization, and then we could actually implement those. So we went through the steps of sales and operations planning. Once again, the important part of sales and operations planning is for all department heads and all decision makers and all of those individuals that have experience, day-to-day tactical experience, I should say, with this to provide input into the sales and operations plan. But then the most important part is, how do we implement it, right? Now we're going to spend a few moments to talk about the ABCs of implementation. We're going to begin with software. So it's going to be a top-down approach. We're going to, in order of importance. So software is important. We're going to begin with that. And then we're going to talk about the data. And then most importantly, we're going to talk about the people and how we implement S&OP. So with the software, if you are still working on Excel spreadsheets, nothing wrong with Excel spreadsheets. People say, as consultants, we used to joke around and say that, Excel is the world's greatest ERP application. So if you are on Excel spreadsheets, you can implement an S&OP process within Excel alone, right? So, the advantages of using Excel or any spreadsheets, I know there's others out there. So the advantage of using spreadsheets such as Excel is that there's going to be low costs. There's no learning curve, because a number of your employees are very familiar and comfortable with Excel. So that is one way that we could implement S&OP very quickly. We can kick off S&OP very quickly by using Excel. But the disadvantages is that there's a lot of weaknesses. There's a lack of, well, some people can do automated processes in Excel. I've seen some very clever things done with Excel, but the simulations in Excel are very cumbersome and slow. But again, if you're using Excel, you would be able to effectively implement sales and operations planning. In my opinion, not optimal, but if that's the only tool that you have, it can be done. Now, from a software perspective, there are a number of organizations that have created standalone S&OP tools, software tools. A number of the ERP providers have built-in S&OP processes within their ERP applications. So S&OP could be a module where it'll feed forecast within this S&OP module. But although you do have that, let's just say hypothetically, you do have a S&OP tool module within your ERP system that you haven't implemented yet, as of yet, it can slow down the implementation of other phases. So let's just say that you're in phase 2 of an ERP implementation. If you're going to bring in S&OP, you're going to slow down the implementation. You're also going to incur a higher cost. And because of that, with anything, you're going to encounter a learning curve of implementing S&OP. Now, the benefit to this is that there's not going to be many people looking at that S&OP module, right? As compared to a production module within the ERP system, or compared to a customer service module or the order entry module, you may have hundreds of people you have to onboard to become familiar with that new tool. With S&OP, with the S&OP module, although it is something new, there's going to be a limited amount of people that's going to be actually using that tool. Other advantages to S&OP, an S&OP module or a standalone S&OP solution is that the simulations are in real time. So it's going to take all the inputs and provide you, in some of these tools, they have a dashboard where it feeds that information in real time. There's going to be a number of alignment with the units per dollar. You're going to have alignment with the volume. We're going to have alignment with the families based on how you have that tool set up. So essentially, it's almost automated, right? Based on a number of inputs. So the sales and the marketing team could input a forecast, and then we could actually run simulations on, is that how does this forecast impact our budget, from a financial perspective? And then we can hit that input, and if we have a capacity input within the sales S&OP tool, it's going to say, okay, are we able to, just by one input, I can have a number of outputs and results based on that by running a simulation. So that's why the S&OP tools are very beneficial. That's why they're very valuable. And then also it will support growth and complexity, in that if we're bringing on a new facility, or if we have subcontractors, if we have co-packers. So co-packers in some industries are subcontractors, but we could actually we're going to have a subcontractor or a co-packer to add in as a facility, right? And then we can run a simulation with that new entrant. Now we can get a quick and immediate response based on the simulation. So that's one thing to consider from an S&OP perspective. So once again, we can, so for the options for our software, we can use Excel spreadsheets. Nothing wrong with Excel spreadsheets, but you just have reduce automation, and the simulations are very cumbersome to create. But this S&OP specific software creates that automation. It creates that real time. You can actually have a dashboard to make better informed decisions, or you can have a hybrid approach. So the reality with the number of these things is that I've seen very few organizations move away from Excel spreadsheets. And with the number of these enterprise resource planning providers, they have transitioned their GUI, their graphical user interface, or their user interface, I should say, to a grid-based view. That way you can export and import data and information to and from Excel or any other spreadsheet, primarily Excel in some of these providers. So The reality is, from an S&OP perspective, a number of organizations will begin with a hybrid approach where, yes, you can provide inputs into the ERP application, the S&OP module within the ERP application, and then you can kind of massage the data within Excel spreadsheets, because that's what people are familiar with, and then they can input it back into like a simulation tool within an ERP, so you can actually have a dashboard, and then you can actually make decisions and discussions based on the S&OP meeting. So moving on to B, data issues. So we all have heard of the term garbage in, garbage out, and that is the reality, where a big problem with a number of organizations in terms of forecast accuracy is the lack of accurate data that they have within their application. So the data issues to consider in implementing S&OP is, are your product families and subfamilies indeed correct? So there's going to need to be a data analyst that continues to ensure that the product families are set up within a system, so we can accurately set up this S&OP process so that we can accurately forecast, right? Our resources, again, our employees, our machines, our facilities, are all machines set up within a system? Is the maintenance set up in the system so that the downtime for a machine is considered whenever we're making forecasts, right? Units of measure is very important. I have some horror stories in terms of the units of measure being incorrect and that getting fed into the forecast, and that causing me a number of problems. So you have to keep that into consideration whenever we're doing an S&OP process, or in all of forecast, right? This is applicable. All of these things that we're discussing is also applicable to anything in regards to forecasting. Load profiles and bills of resources is another thing that's important. Sales prices and gross margins are going to be important when the CFO or controller is looking at the budget as an input to the sales and operations planning. And then the actuals from a sales perspective in terms of inventories and backlog is another thing that we need to consider to ensure that is indeed accurate. Again, that goes into the units of measure. Again, horror stories where I've seen customer service reps have this information in an Excel spreadsheet, but not have it in the ERP system. And it wreaked havoc from a forecasting S&OP perspective. So keep that in mind. Ensure that we have one system of record. We have one source from an S&OP and forecasting perspective. And then we also have the demand and supply chain strategies that are in and transparent to everyone. So again, target inventory goods, days on hand, these numbers could actually be set up on a dashboard on the ERP system. Okay. So if you do have dashboards within your ERP tool, I would do some research. If you don't use dashboard, let me back up. If you don't use dashboards, current state, I would take a look or ask leadership or ask your director of IT within your organization to see, how we can implement dashboards so we can get a quick snapshot of these numbers, because that can provide a quick view into potential issues, and that can actually be very, very valuable within this S&OP implementation. So going to the people, most important part. Everything we discussed, so going back to what I said at the beginning of this discussion, everything we discussed is null and void if you do not get your people to adopt. I will say that I will make this statement time and time again. The late, great Jack Welch always said, in order to influence change, you have to tell a people all the way down to the lowest level employee of the organization. You have to tell a people where we're going. We're implementing SNOP. How are we going to get there? We're getting there with you and your input, right? How is it going to positively impact your role, right? It's human nature that people primarily care about what's in it for them, right? So you have to say, how is SNOP going to positively impact them, right? Without this organizational change, without every single employee of the organization adopting this change, you risk a failed SNOP implementation, right? I implemented ERP applications for a number of years. And that's the very first thing I would say in the kickoff meeting. For executives, they have to have an all hands meeting, and they have to say, where are we going? How are we going to get there? How's it going to positively impact you? If those employees feel they have input into this process, they will adopt this SNOP process. If you say this SNOP process will make your life easier because we can more accurately forecast, now you're not running around picking products last minute. Now you're not working overtime, right? Because our forecasts were incorrect. If we say in the all hands meeting, if we provide more visibility, if we're able to more accurately ship our products, we make more money, and now you get raises. That's how you get adoption, right? So organizational change is very important, but in order to influence, in order to gain adoption, you have to have discipline from a leadership perspective, and then your employees have to have discipline as well. You have to have accountability. Everyone has to have accountability within this process. Now, you may encounter conflict because there's always going to be someone that's resistant to change. Once again, human nature, right? But I have found as a consultant, if I focus my efforts on that resistor and I make that resistor a fan, that goes across the organization, because now I have a cheerleader in my court, right? If you make that one resistor feel important, if you make that one resistor to feel that they have input into this new change, this new implementation, you're going to get adoption. Now, this may be hard for some people, but if that resistor is continuing to resist, your organization might not be the best place for them. But you have to love you have to love the person on the way out the same way you love them on the way in. That may sound bad, but let me explain. One resistor could ruin the whole implementation, which could result in losses for the organization. And then you may have to lay off dozens of employees for one resistor. So that's one thing to keep in mind from an organizational perspective. So that's how you have to manage conflict within an organization. So with the implementation principles, once again, people are the most important thing. If you do not get it, I could have the perfect sales and operations planning approach, implementation approach, right? But if I don't put my people first, it could potentially fail, right? So whenever we say implementation begins and ends with the leader of the business, that's because you have to walk the talk, right? So a lot of leaders feel that an S&OP process is the inventory manager's job, or the production manager's job, or the sales manager's job, sales and operations planning. It feels it's it's an organizational initiative, right? And if you walk the talk, the most successful projects that I was a part of as a consultant were the ones where the leader, the CEO of the organization, was in every single meeting, every single training session, right? I knew that executive was super busy, but they made every single effort to be in every single session. And the employees seen that. So those leaders walked the talk, right? One of them was with a large organization that you know very well. I can say I'm giving them accolades. So Intel, the main decision maker for the implementation, he was in every single meeting, right? And all the employees that came in during the implementation, all the employees that came into their training session, seeing that leader in there doing transactions just like a customer service rep. That leader walked the talk. Small and medium organization, the CEO in every single meeting. And he would go, but he was working, but I would actually make a statement, and he would go back in his notebook and say, Justin, on like a month ago, you said this. The employees seen that. He walked the talk. Both of those projects were probably some of my most successful projects. So whenever it says implementation begins and ends with the leader, that's 1000% the case. So whenever we say to involve top management at the very onset, that's the thing. So in some of the other projects, we'll have the kickoff. Vice presidents would come in for the kickoff, understand the project, would never see him again until go live, right? Those were difficult projects because there was a lack of buy-in. I would not say that there was no buy-in, there was a lack of buy-in, right? And because of that those projects struggled, right? But for those projects where the executives were a part throughout the whole entire process, throughout the pilots, throughout the testing, throughout the training, those are very successful projects, right? So also, whenever it says build it and they will come, you will actually, implement again within a number of projects. A number of organizations will have initiatives, they'll have projects, and some of those projects will just, die out, right? If you build it first, and then you have an all hands meeting, and then you actually get buy-in, then you'll actually get buy-in not only from the employees, but you'll get buy-in from the other executives as well. Now, in most cases, like I said, you want to get as many executives as possible throughout this whole entire process, but you don't want to have too many cooks in the kitchen, right? So if you have buy-in throughout the executives throughout the whole entire process, you are more setting yourself up for success. So how does this look from an implementation perspective? So going back to my days as a consultant, I'm out of consulting now, so there's no bias in that. But if you are beginning your path in terms of S&OP, it may be good to look to a third party, to look to a consulting firm that does this, to get an outside view of your environment, of your organizational culture, and adopting and implementing sales and operations planning. So once you have a third party to assess your current state S&OP processes, or to assess your capabilities to implement S&OP, that's where you would have an executive briefing of go or no go, whether or not to move forward with the adoption of an S&OP process within your organization. And once all decision makers of the organization come to an agreement that we can indeed move forward with this process, then you would go to a consulting firm, or you can do it internally, and you would have a kickoff session. So that's where all executives and the third party, if you use a third party, would come together to discuss this process, the steps that take place in this process, the resources that are needed to successfully implement an S&OP process. And then, once you have implemented all of the processes, once you have put the pieces in place, then you would have a pilot. So a pilot is essentially where you would test out these processes before you release it into the organization. And then once you perform that pilot, once you perform that testing, then you would do another retrospective to say what went well with the S&OP pilot, what did not go so well. If we need to pivot and make adjustments and do a second pilot, if you will. I've done that often from a consulting perspective. But once you have that second go or no go, then you would actually go live with this S&OP process. And if you're a multinational organization, then you would actually expand this S&OP process overseas. If you have multiple facilities within your respective country, then you would actually expand this process to other facilities. Some people, so that's another discussion that we would have during that executive briefing of the go or no go, in that, are we going to do a phased approach where we do S&OP within one facility to see how it goes, make adjustments, and then expand it out to other facilities or expand it out to other countries? Or do we do a big bang approach? Okay. Again, it depends on your environment. It depends on your culture. I just feel that, because some facilities will have different cultures, because some locations will have different aspects or things that may cause you to do a phased approach. That completely depends upon your organization. So once you go through that expansion in phase 2, if needed, then you would do a financial integration into phase 3, where you can actually pull in the tools within the ERP application. And then you could actually go to phase 4, where you could increase the collaboration and communication with business partners, where you actually share that information with your business partners so that they can be more proactive in ensuring that everyone is on the same page, not within our 4 walls, but across our business partner network as well. This approach, as you can see here, it's a low risk approach, low cost approach, and it's going to provide high impact. So that the whole how you would approach this S&OP implementation is a whole discussion in its own, but this is just a high level of a few things that you can consider in adopting the S&OP process. So as we're wrapping up, the S&OP, the executive S&OP process is going to be broken if the top management is not involved. We talked about that a lot within this session. And if the teamwork, if we do not include all decision makers, if we do not include all employees, we do not get adoption within this S&OP process. Okay. If the meeting attendance is poor, that would be a quick indicator that there is no adoption into this process. So if that meeting attendance is poor, we need to pivot and go back with our executives to see how we can increase that meeting attendance. If we don't get that meeting attendance, maybe we should rethink the implementation of an S&OP process, because if we don't have meeting attendance, we're not going to have adoption once this thing gets rolled out. We also need to focus on the mix and the short term. So we want to look at the tactical, because again, it's going to be a roll up. That tactical short term operational processes is going to provide inputs into the long term success of the organization. We always want to create conflict management, right? Again, with any change, there's going to be resistance, and with resistance, you're going to have conflict, right? So we have to manage conflict among decision makers, and we have to manage conflict among resistors within the organization. We can't have finger pointing within the executive S&OP process, because with the increased transparency, there's going to be increased accountability, even among executives, even among decision makers. So that could often lead to finger pointing. And we have to provide accountability among everyone, all the way up to the CEO and president of the organization, right? Accountability is going to be very important to this process, because the transparency is this might provide the most transparency your organization has ever had, right? So accountability is going to increase, and then we need to ensure that those decisions are made within the process, and that's where the executives are going to come in to be the tiebreaker in some of these decisions. Okay. So again, to continue to mitigate risk, we need to come together as a group. We need to lead together as a group. We need to be together throughout the whole entire process, right? We want to ensure that we conduct a self-audit among all decision makers, all stakeholders within this S&OP process. We want again, retrospectives for continuous improvement, right? Not only are we doing retrospectives for continuous improvement for the S&OP process as a whole, we also want to do a retrospective for continuous improvement from an individual level as well, okay? So we also want to ensure that the decision makers, the heads, so the CEOs and the presidents and the people that are performing these activities on a day-to-day basis are participating in this. We want to, once we provide that retrospective, we want to fix those issues. And then, as I said before, we want to, if we have some holes, we may need to consider a re-implementation of the S&OP process to fix those issues. So going back to my time as a consultant, I was brought into organizations to essentially do re-implementations. They implemented a certain process. They implemented organizational change, enterprise resource planning, S&OP processes. And, I had to provide a current state assessment of those initiatives. And then we had to do an implementation where we had to kind of start from scratch. I had to rip everything out and start from scratch. So, that's not initially, some organizations may feel that, that implementation was a failure. But again, we're striving for continuous improvement, in terms of providing a re-implementation of an initiative. So where is the future in S&OP sales and operations planning headed? We're going to see, in some cases, the whole lean manufacturing concept is being reviewed from an academic perspective. Is actually being researched right now to see whether or not lean manufacturing is applicable to some industries. That statement is not a broad statement. It goes from an industry to industry perspective. And for those industries that continue to adopt lean manufacturing, you're going to see S&OP integrated with that. Globalization is going to be a very important thing. We've seen that with the pandemic, in that, you know, these disruptions are going to be one thing to consider as we move forward to the future. So S&OP was one thing that was first adopted within manufacturing, but you're also seeing it introduced into other areas such as healthcare. Right. Again, the pandemic showed that there are some holes in operational processes, and some industries such as healthcare are looking to introduce sales and operations planning within their processes. So you're also going back to from a software perspective, you're seeing ERP applications integrate modules for sales and operations planning, but you're also seeing standalone solutions for S&OP for smaller organizations. And you're starting to see greater financial integration in feeding of this data from a financial perspective within these S&OP tools. And going back to what we discussed, you're starting to see executives talk about S&OP from an operational perspective. No, it's just S&OP is just not like a planning tool. It's beginning to be more of an executive tool. So you're starting to see more executives being more involved within this initiative. So that's all we have to discuss today. Once again, for more information on sales and operations planning, you can go to tfwallace.com. That is Tom Wallace's, the late great Tom Wallace's website to discuss S&OP. Once again, Tom Wallace is the founder, or he did a lot of work in S&OP throughout the years. And if you have any more questions for me, you can email me at justin.golston@sidtech.ai. And you can also see the locations for the Chartered Institute of Professional Certifications. Thank you.